Welcome back. Unless, of course, this is your first time listening, then just welcome. My name is Ken, and this is my philosophy book. So, let me ask you a question. Are you a good problem solver? When faced with a problem, would you say logic and reason are the best tools at your disposal to find that conclusion for yourself? And one last question. Is the right decision always the right decision? Let me tell you a story. Okay, here's the deal. You're in a police station, okay? You can own up to your crime now, yourself, or inform on your friend. If you do, he's going to get 10 years in prison, but you get to walk free now. But see, you know the police have you for possession of weapons. You were caught carrying knives when they took you in, so they can have you for at least a year anyway. But you know there's not enough evidence to pin this crime on you and your friend. The catch? Your friend is in the next room getting the very same deal, and if you both inform on each other, you're going to get 5 years in prison. So, what do you do? Well, look, you're no fool. You know, I can tell that. So you start thinking. Let's say your friend in the next room, his name is Harry. If Harry keeps quiet and you confess, he gets 10 years and you get to walk free. That's what we want. That's the best possible conclusion to come out of this, right? But if Harry informs on you, it's still better to confess, because then you get 5 years. Because the only other alternative is if you say nothing, then you're going to get 10 years and he goes free. So you decide to confess, right? Well, the problem, Harry is no fool either, and he comes to the exact same conclusion as you did. So he informs on you, you inform on him, and you both get 5 years. But if you had both said nothing, you both only would have got 1 year in prison. So how did that happen? I mean, we made a decision, and it was based on rational thought. We used logic to come to that decision. We went through it every step of the way, and reason told us that that was our best course of action. It was the lesser of two evils. So it was the right call, but it wasn't. And this is what's known as game theory. It's looking at situations like this and finding rational solutions. The problem is these rational solutions may not always be obvious, or the most obvious choice, and they may not even seem that rational at first. Game theory is all about strategy, and the aim of this strategy is to maximize your own advantage. So you want to come away with the best possible deal for yourself. And you're thinking, yeah, and the best possible deal out of the prisoners was, I go free, he gets 10 years, but there was no way we were going to get that. Well, game theory looks at the other options available to you. So in this strategy, there's two ways of going about it. We have cooperation, which is working with your opponent, and we have defection, which is working against them. Now that might sound a little bit strange. Cooperation with the opponent. Why not always defect? Why not always work against your opponent? Because surely what's good for you is bad for your opponent and the opposite. So why would I want to help them? Why would I cooperate with them? It's in the name. Opponent, they are the opposition. But if we look back at our prisoner dilemma, if we had cooperated with Harry in the next room, who was our enemy at the time, he was our opposition, we would have got out with 1 year each instead of 5. And even though rational thought brought us to that conclusion, and it seemed like we were taking all the right steps, we wound up with a worse solution. One way how game theory helps explain this and helps put us in the right frame of mind is it categorizes different types of games. So there's different types, and you have to know which kind of game you're playing to know the best strategy for that game. So, for example, zero-sum games are games where the winnings on one side are exactly balanced by the losses on the other side. So what does that mean? Imagine a game of poker where there are 100 chips on the table. I have 50 and my friend Harry has 50. Now, however many chips Harry loses is however many I gain. There will never be more or less chips on the table. They just change players. So I can be a winner, he can be a loser, there can be a draw, but the chips stay the same. That's a zero-sum game where the losses and the winnings balance each other out. However, the other side of that is a non-zero sum game, and that's the kind of game we were playing with our prisoners, and that is a game where there can be two winners or two losers. So both players have the opportunity to win or lose. And when you start thinking about this, this is when you realize you have to get your critical thinking cap on, because it's not just about winning or losing. Because in a game of poker, yes, what is bad for your opponent is good for you, because the more chips he loses, the more you gain. In a non-zero sum game like this, it's not about beating your opponent, it's about getting the best possible advantage for yourself. And that might not be the most obvious one all of the time. Now maybe you're taking this into mind and you're thinking back to the prisoner dilemma and you think, okay, yeah, in hindsight, maybe they should have worked together, but they're in two different cells. They can't communicate, so what were they supposed to do? It was still the right decision based on the situation that they were in. And maybe there is an element of truth in that. However, what this game theory tells us is that their reasoning was wrong from the very beginning, because both men chose a strategy that avoids the individual worst case scenario, the individual loss. And it's all based on them, because they believe they were playing a zero-sum game. What's bad for him is good for me, and vice versa. But that wasn't the case. If they had recognized that it was better to aim for the best collective outcome, they wouldn't have ended up with a compromise which made no one happy. In other words, they refused the little win because they were too afraid of the big loss. So, how is this used in the real world? It's a strategy used by a lot of businesses today, as well as politicians. And think about it. This kind of collective little win scenario thinking is what a lot of politicians do. That's why you see some politicians who, obviously their goal is to be the biggest party. They want to be the party in power. But they agree to join coalitions and set up kind of dual party systems with other parties who are also kind of in power. And why do they do this? It's because they know if they go for their personal big win, they will lose, because that's not how you play the game. It's not that simple. They have to be critical thinking, and they know and recognize that the collective goal is sometimes the best strategy to strive for, as opposed to a personal goal or an individual outcome. But to put it in perspective even more and think of it on a larger scale, cast your mind back to the 1980s, and USA was in an arms race with the USSR. It was a Cold War. Now, if both sides had took a collective little win by reducing and limiting their arms production, they would have been far better off. But they didn't. Why? Because they were both afraid of the individual big loss, which is military defeat. And how did they end up? In the middle, with this compromise that no one was happy with. A little bit like our two prisoners, who are now going to spend the next 5 years clutching onto soap for dear life. Another example of situations like the prisoner dilemma we can see in real life happens a lot in places like the USA. So if you've watched Better Call Saul, which is big at the moment, or any kind of law show that's based in the USA, you'll probably have heard of a thing called the plea bargain. So what is a plea bargain? Basically, it's where you make a deal to reduce your sentence. So it could be, in this case, informing on someone who was a co-conspirator in your crime. They get a harsher sentence, you get a more lenient sentence because you cooperated. Or it could be as simple as admit you're guilty now and you'll get 5 years. Or insist on your innocence, we'll take you to court. If you're proved guilty, you'll get 15. Now, why does a system like this exist? Why would they do that? It's because it's quicker to do things this way. Imagine someone who is brought in on a low-level crime, drug possession, robbery, something like this that's not going to make headline news. They want to process them, get them in and out as quick as possible because of overcrowding, underfunding, lack of resources, and all that kind of stuff. So, someone who comes in who will most likely be found guilty, they have two options. They can either insist upon their innocence and go to court, which wastes valuable resources and time, or they can admit they're guilty, save everyone a lot of hassle, and the benefit for both sides is apparent. One saves time and money, the other gets a more lenient sentence. The problem, though, which is kind of funny with this kind of system, is what can happen is people who are guilty will just admit their guilt and get a more lenient sentence. But say, for example, someone who is wrongfully convicted, who wants to press the matter and pursue the fact that they are innocent and takes it to court, if they're found guilty, they'll get a harsher sentence than someone who just admitted their guilt. And maybe that makes sense to you, and it does a little bit to me, but maybe that's how we're conditioned to think because we're seeing all these different kind of stories and stuff. It's just funny that someone who says, yes, that was me, I did it, I robbed that person, oh yeah, okay, community service. And someone who says, no, it wasn't me, I didn't do that. 20 years. Lock 'em up, throw away the key. Or something like that. Another game that game theorists like to study is the game of chicken. So, chicken. Two people in cars drive towards each other in a straight line, and the person who turns away first is the loser. The rules are simple, but there's an interesting bit of psychology that goes into it when we apply the strategy of game theory. So if we look at this using game theory, we think, okay, what are our options? We can cooperate. What is cooperation in these terms? Swerving away. It's where we work with our opponent, not against them. We work with them to get the best possible solution, which is to not die. So we turn away. Now, the other end of that is defection. We work against our opponent. What is that? We keep driving straight and crash into him. So we assume that cooperation is the rational choice. Done and dusted, that's it. Close the book, turn off the lights, episode over. Except for the fact that there is the human element, which also factors into game theory, because driver A, assuming that driver B is a rational person, he's a sane person who makes good decisions, apart from getting into this game of chicken, he assumes that he's going to make the rational choice and cooperate. He's going to swerve away because he doesn't want to die. So he thinks, well, if he's going to swerve, then I'm just going to keep driving straight and then I'm going to win. And you can see the apparent danger in that, because then driver B thinks driver A is a rational person who is going to cooperate and swerve at the last minute. So driver B thinks, well, I'm going to drive straight and I'm going to win. Then you've got two people making decisions using their rational logic to come to a conclusion. And they've both decided that they're going to drive straight at each other to win. And it's funny how rationale and logic have brought us to this conclusion again, a conclusion which I think we can quite easily say is not the right one. You shouldn't drive at the person because, well, we both know if they're both thinking this, they're going to hit each other. So that's obviously not the right decision, but they've both used logic. They've both used reason to get to this decision. And it's funny. And game theory explores this kind of idea. So, what can you take away from this? Well, number one, you've got to know the game. Is it a zero-sum game or a non-zero-sum game? Are you playing to win, or are you playing to reap the best possible rewards that can be got from the limited situation? So maybe you won't win, you'll take a smaller win, but it's better than a compromise which serves no one. Number two, know your opponent. Are they the kind of person that's going to swerve? Are they going to cooperate or defect? Are you going to drive head on at them, or are they going to drive head on at you? But I think number three that we take away from this, which is probably the most important, is don't let yourself get put in a situation like this where you'll have to make those decisions. So don't go around carrying knives and robbing people, and don't get into games of chicken, and hopefully you won't have to come across this kind of thing. But if you do, for whatever reason, your life has brought you down this path, use critical thinking and understand that the most obvious answer might not be the most obvious solution. It might not be the right solution. And using rationale and reason and logic to get to a decision might not always mean it's the right decision. You've got to look at it from every angle. And when it comes to games like this, your opponent is not necessarily always your enemy. You might be able to use them to get a better reward than if you worked against them. I'm sure there's loads more we could talk about on game theory and loads more examples. If you want to watch a film that explains it a bit, watch A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. It's all about John Forbes Nash and the Nash equilibrium, which is basically just another form of game theory and goes over the same thing, which is the most obvious answer is not always the right one or the one you want to go for. You want to go for the one that reaps you the best possible advantage. That might mean sharing that advantage and taking a smaller victory as opposed to a bigger individual win, but you will avoid the worst case scenario, which is the biggest individual loss. And that, in a nutshell, is game theory. I'll leave you with this food for thought. It's all about the game and how you play it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.